First of all, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak to this distinguished audience today. I will try to keep you stimulated and awake while I try to give you a little nugget of what I've been thinking about the city of Colombo for actually the past decade or so. So the theme of this session is about creating resilient cities. And I thought it would be worth kind of pondering for a minute what that really means for the city of Colombo, because most of you in the audience today who are present in person are kind of stakeholders in that transformation process. So we all know changing Colombo or transforming Colombo is about balancing opposing forces, the economic vitality of the city, the environmental protection of the city, and of course maintaining social equity. So let me just jump right in and talk through a few things, give you guys a few thoughts to ponder. Again, everybody knows this. Colombo is very much the economic engine of Sri Lanka, and that's really not going to change anytime soon. So while we have a fairly dispersed population, 43% of Sri Lanka's GDP is generated in Colombo, so in the Western province, sorry. So there's really no way around having to deal with what is the future of the Western province. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'd like to maybe highlight another side that we often neglect. Colombo is actually South Asia's only wetland city recognized by the Ramsar Convention. It's a very, very rare and special thing that we have. And the drawing you see on the right is really what we call the Colombo Wetland Complex, which is recognized by the Ramsar Convention, and this is Colombo District. You also see the demarcations of the various boundaries of the CMC, Colombo North, Colombo South, and so on that make up what we know as Greater Colombo. And you will also notice that Colombo North and Colombo South have almost no wetlands left in the pictures, but Colombo Wetland Complex is not alone. It is really part of a very vast network of wetlands and green spaces that really dominate the overall Western province. So the question to us in a way is, how do we manage our economic engine in balance with what we have here? So it's not only about wetlands. Why the wetlands are important is partly about what makes Sri Lanka special. You know, we celebrate our biodiversity, but people often forget that Colombo is home to a whole bunch of endangered wildlife, right? And some of these species are critically endangered, and we live side by side with them every day. One of the things I really enjoy coming into Colombo is seeing spot-billed pelicans on lampposts. This is a globally endangered species that lives in our city on lampposts. So we take these for granted. We see them as a problem, but really we need to start seeing them as really a national treasure. And how do we coexist, and how do we grow as a city, as a country as well, in coexistence with what we have, these incredible natural gifts. So the wetlands, I believe, in the Western province and in Colombo in particular, are fundamentally important and must be an integral part of how we think about evolving our cities. Again, all of you would know this, but wetlands, besides kind of being pretty and providing home to to a lot of wildlife, provide a whole bunch of ecosystem services as well, and not least of which is flood mitigation. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So this is something really interesting. You know, we often hear complaints about urbanization. And I would argue that actually the problem of urbanization in Sri Lanka is not the fact that we are urbanizing. It's really the pattern of urbanization that we have adopted. And the keynote speakers about an hour ago mentioned the same thing, Professor Yoon. You know, the question is, how do we want to do this? So this is a time series of urbanization in Sri Lanka and development intensity, and you can really see it. There's no mistake. Over the last, this is two and a half decades, you know, our development is really spreading like a bit of a rash across the Western province, and it's taking with it our precious ecosystems as well. This shows it slightly better. The red are settlements. And you can, I mean, it's not a rocket scientist, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out we really are eating into this, and it's not a sustainable way forward. So the question is, how do we change that? It's worth stopping for a second and thinking about what are the root causes of this pattern that we have. What is really driving it? So a few nuggets from my end for this. I would argue that our urban fabric is really the result of decades and decades of suboptimal urban policy. The way we think about urbanization, the way we think about planning at a kind of macro level, and even how we think about urban design probably needs to change. We have a problem of unchecked sprawl across the Western province, but really across all of our cities in the country. We have extremely fragmented low land holdings, again, across the country. We have low density, widely dispersed housing, and we have really just no investment in mass transit. I'll give a little bit more color on this. So this is how population has grown in different parts of the city, different parts of the Western province over the last couple of decades. We don't have the most recent census period, but it's unmistakable that we are seeing a movement of population from Colombo city to the fringe. Well, Gampaha is really the fastest growing district in Sri Lanka. And this unmistakable shift outside from the city to the outer parts of the city corresponds with the image I showed you earlier of us taking out our natural habitat. So this pattern really is quite problematic for multiple reasons, which I won't spend too much time on. Here's the pattern of industry. Same problem. It's spread everywhere. And there's really, you can't find a pattern in the way we are urbanizing. As a province, as a city, as a country even, we find it very, very difficult to say, look, what are we really trying to do? Where are we going? This is what it looks like in real life. The numbers are great, but these are the pictures. These were taken a couple of years ago by my team. This is the view from Vauxhall Street, and you look any direction, and this is what you see. The image on the right shows the height of development that we see across the Western province. Pink is 1 to 2 floors. Right? So we are spreading ourselves really, really thin across a vast area of land. And this is not sustainable. The graph shows you how many of us live in condominiumized or apartment-style housing. We are an outlier probably in the world. We're like 10% or so apartment-style housing. It's kind of weird actually when you think about it. And this change in the way we approach this is absolutely critical for progress of this country. I think it's absolutely critical. So this pattern has to change. And I think all of you in this audience, the urban designers, the architects, the thinkers, the planners, have a key role to play. What do we do to change this? Here's another problem: fragmentation of land. You drive by any city, you'll see lots of banners of subdividing land. This is a cancer. So what we do is we take beautiful landscapes, carve them up into 6 to 10 perch lots, and then we spread ourselves thin at 2 stories. We wipe out all the wetlands, we wipe out all the forests, and we create communities that really no longer are as people-friendly as we want them to be, and then we complain about social problems. So this is a problem that needs to change. Why is this a problem? I mean, I guess the fundamental problem is that it's land intensive in a place where we have inadequate land, or land that we need to protect for wetlands and other services. But there's also an economic side to this. This low density, thin sprawl we have is impossible to serve efficiently with infrastructure. It's just impossible. Because it's so sprawled and so low density. That's why we have so many other infrastructure related issues that, regardless of how many governments we change, we can't change it actually. Because the fundamental economics of it don't work at low density. So we sprawl across the Western province, but most of us come back to Colombo, probably every day, right? So this is a couple of years old, this data, but we have about 2 million passenger trips coming into Colombo every day, okay? 600,000 vehicles coming in. And you all know, traffic is horrendous, right? And this is, again, a fundamental problem. While we have disaggregated the city, we really haven't disaggregated the social systems, the social infrastructure. So really, we have to converge back on it. So we haven't solved the problem. We've actually created another problem, a problem of transportation. This is kind of interesting for those of you who look at policy a little bit. This shows how much we have invested in public transport versus roads. We love our roads. We've invested next to nothing in public transportation. In the last decade, 2-3 decades, we really haven't. And as a result, we are really addicted to cars. We love our cars, right? So 52% of the passengers entering the city use 6% of the road space, which is in public vehicles, right? About 45% of us use 87% of the road space. We're addicted to cars. Again, this is not sustainable for Sri Lanka, which is why we had such long fuel queues a couple of years ago. We were hooked on this thing. But the consequences of this addiction to cars and this sprawling settlement isn't limited to high gas bills and economic costs and environmental costs. An often not spoken about consequences of this is social impact. We have an extremely low women's labor force participation rate. You talk to any young mother who lives in Malame and has to work to Colombo, as soon as they have a kid, they don't know how they can get back and forth from work to deal with the child. A lot of women drop out of the workforce because of this. Our public transport systems have so much harassment that most girls don't like to use them. And we have to be honest about this. This is really a problem. How much time, and this is taken 2 days ago at rush hour, this timing, how much time do we spend on a day going back and forth from our workplaces, from our schools? I have a friend that told me a couple of years ago, it's like, look, she lived in Kotta and went to school at St. Bridget's. She said, I know my driver better than I know my father. We can laugh, but that's a real problem. What is the social cost of this disaggregation of our urban environment? It's a massive problem. And we don't talk about this, the education issues, the women's rights issues, the impact of women not coming to the workforce, and the cascading social impacts of this. We really don't talk about it, and we really should acknowledge it and think about it. So, to me, this low density sprawl and this addiction to private transportation is toxic for Sri Lanka. It's disastrous for Sri Lanka, and we must unite to change this. We have no choice but to change this. But it's really fundamentally important to wake up and make some noise about it, and for people to really start talking about it and thinking proactively about how do you take this on. So the world we have created around us, this is of course Albert Einstein, much smarter than me, but the world we have created around Colombo is the product of the way we think about it and the way we have been thinking about it for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It actually doesn't go that much further back, because before then we had some of the most advanced public transport systems in Asia, in Colombo. So we need to fundamentally change this. So I have a very simple prescription for this. It's a bit idealistic, and there's a lot more detail that we can get into, but to me there are really just 3 fundamental things we need to try to do. And I think we all need to mobilize to do this. The first and foremost is really densify housing. We have to fundamentally think differently about housing. This single family detached 2-story per house, 1 story per 10 purchase is just not doable anymore. It's not affordable anymore. It has massive social consequences, but it has enormous environmental social consequences as well. So we really need to think concertedly about how do we densify housing. We also need to think about how do we transition Sri Lanka into mass transit in a much more systematic way. Not just lip service to it. How do you really make that happen? How do you kick our addiction to private transport? And that will be a huge step forward. And as you do these two, the question is, how do you start doing transit-oriented development where you densify and you develop with mass transit and people movement at the top of your mind? How do you do that? And that's really, to me, the simple thing, the simple ethos that should be at the core of how we think about our cities going forward. So a couple of quick things. I spend a lot of time, I've been on this on multiple sides of the equation. I've been on the policy side, I've been on the investment side, I'm on the development side. But this is a real serious problem. And there's a whole host of things you can do to try to reduce, to make this densification happen. And to be clear, by densification I don't mean everything has to be high-rise. I'm saying even if we go to like 4 stories, we're going to halve what we are using as a footprint, right? But there are lots of things that hold us back here, not least of which is kind of regulatory constraints. People who work with me know one of my pet peeves is this parking regulation of ours. We have to build 1.1 parking slots per apartment unit in the heart of the city. So you build about a 600 square foot or 700 square foot apartment, you build a 350 square foot parking lot. The economics of it are crazy as a developer, but even more crazy as a buyer, because you're paying for that extra 350 square feet where you really shouldn't have to. So it's really hard to make things viable when our regulations, and parking is just one of them. How do we deal with mixed-use developments, complex large-scale developments, sharing of land rights, and so those sorts of things. There's lots of things that we have to do in the policy environment to make this happen. Para-tariffs is another one. We have lots of protectionism in the building material space. Those of you involved in construction would know this. You bring a steel bar to port, but by the time you bring it to your site, it's 100% extra. That protects local steel companies, yes, but at the end, who is paying this price? It's the consumer, right? So there's a cascade of issues that we need to deal with to unravel the problem of housing and encourage a transformation into more dense housing. The second is this transition to mass transit. And you know, I've been actively involved in this space a few years ago, and you know, the tragedy of transport in Sri Lanka is the clash of egos. People tend to champion one mode over another. I like to think of transport as kind of our own blood circulation system. If you take Colombo as your heart, say Colombo Fort is your heart, you have big arteries, you have smaller ones, and you have micro arteries. The whole thing works like a system. That's the same way a transportation system works. You need modes of transport that can take high volumes of people, and you need all these other networks to feed in. So you can't just fix buses, or you can't just fix trains, you can't just build an LRT. You actually need all these things to work together. Again, you need to think big, and the country needs to kind of embrace this as a fundamental shift that we need to embrace. And when we do this, we help kick the habit of private transport. Not many youngsters in the room, but most of the youngsters here, I bet, the first thing you aspire after you get out of university is buy a really fancy cell phone. The next thing you aspire is to buy a car. Right? Most of you all will invest in a car that is probably more expensive than a housing unit in some places. And it's really quite tragic. The final thing, the third piece of this is really once you get the transportation network invested right and you really have this ethos of densifying housing, the question is how do you start to do these two in tandem? And there's many examples around the world of extremely successful transit-oriented development. It's a kind of natural linkage of the two. But when you start to do this, you really start to save the things that we need to save to make Sri Lanka what it can be, and to preserve the character of the Colombo we have, preserve the character of the Western province, and really give ourselves identity. So I asked ChatGPT what that would look like. I don't necessarily agree with this, but I don't fundamentally disagree with it either. You know, so you put this paragraph-long thing of what I was going to say into ChatGPT and say, give me an image. That's what they give us. I think that's a little better than what we have now. So I will just leave you with that thought, and I hope all of you all join me in kind of advocating for this kind of change. And I think if we all work together, we actually can achieve this within our lifetimes. Thank you very much.